the spreadsheet cells blurred together like watercolors left in the rain. I blinked hard, forcing my eyes to refocus on the column of numbers that refused to reconcile. 3 hours hunched over the portable workstation in the marble-floored corridor of the Fontaine estate, and my lower back had begun its familiar protest, a dull throb that radiated down to my hips whenever I stayed in one position too long. I was Yara Race, 30 years old, with a reputation for catching discrepancies that made corporate executives sweat during quarterly reviews. My specialty wasn't dramatic financial collapses or explosive fraud cases. I found the small inconsistencies, the rounding errors that compounded over fiscal years, the phantom expenses that bled companies dry one seemingly insignificant transaction at a time. Numbers told stories to those who knew how to listen. And right now, the Fontaine Hotel Group's books were whispering something that didn't quite add up. The temporary contract had come through my agency with unusual urgency. 60 days to audit the financial records of a luxury hotel empire, on site at the family's private estate outside the city. The pay was exceptional, enough to finally replace my 10-year-old sedan and maybe, just maybe, take an actual vacation instead of billing clients during my supposed time off. My supervisor had presented it as a career-making opportunity. I'd seen it as a chance to work without fluorescent office lights giving me migraines. Now, standing in a hallway that could have doubled as a museum gallery, I wondered if I'd made a mistake. The Fontaine mansion was obscene in its elegance. Not the gaudy nouveau riche type that screamed for attention, but the quiet generational wealth kind that didn't need to prove anything. Crown molding traced intricate patterns across 14-foot ceilings. Original oil paintings, actual museum pieces, not reproductions, hung between sconces that probably cost more than my annual salary. The marble beneath my sensible flats was veined with gold, polished to a mirror shine that reflected my decidedly ordinary appearance back at me. I'd dressed professionally, as always. Charcoal slacks, a cream silk blouse, my dark hair pulled back in a low bun that kept it out of my face during long work sessions. Minimal jewelry, just the simple gold watch my grandmother had left me, the kind with an actual winding mechanism that ticked audibly in quiet rooms. No unnecessary ornamentation. I was there to work, not to impress. "Ms. Rice?" A woman's voice echoed down the corridor. I turned to find Wendy Paiva, the administrative assistant who'd greeted me that morning, approaching with a coffee service on a silver tray. She was young, maybe 25, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she hadn't been working here long either. "I thought you might need refreshment. You've been out here for hours." "Thank you." I accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. Expensive coffee, the kind that came in small batches from single-origin farms. Even their hospitality was premium. I'm just trying to cross-reference these quarterly reports with the individual property statements. The numbers keep shifting. Wendy's expression flickered. Was that concern? Fear? But she smoothed it away quickly, replacing it with a professional smile. "The family keeps comprehensive records. I'm sure you'll find everything in order. Mr. Fonseca is very particular about documentation." Xavier Fonseca, the name on every signature line, every approval stamp, every executive decision in the files I'd reviewed. 43 years old according to the corporate registry, though I hadn't met him yet. The estate manager had shown me to this workspace, explaining that Mr. Fonseca was traveling and would return later in the week. Fine by me. I preferred working without executives hovering over my shoulder, asking questions that revealed they didn't understand their own financial statements. "I'm sure," I replied neutrally. "Though I have noticed some interesting patterns in the ancillary revenue streams. Does the hotel group have any gaming licenses? I see regular transfers that look like they could be casino-related, but there's no line item for gambling operations in the business registry." Wendy's hand trembled slightly as she set down the cream pitcher. "I really wouldn't know about the specifics. My role is purely administrative. Perhaps you should direct those questions to Mr. Fonseca when he returns." The deflection was smooth, practiced. I filed it away mentally. Another small discrepancy in a growing list. Of course. When is he expected back? This evening, actually. His travel plans changed. Wendy straightened, gathering the tray. You'll meet him at dinner, 7 o'clock in the formal dining room. Mr. Fonseca likes to personally welcome all extended stay contractors. After she left, I returned to my spreadsheets, but the numbers seemed even more suspicious now. Large cash deposits at irregular intervals, always just under the reporting threshold that would trigger automatic reviews. Payments to shell companies with generic names, Riverside Consulting, Summit Advisory, Meridian Services, that had no web presence and minimal corporate footprints. Either the Fontaine Hotel Group was engaged in aggressive tax optimization, which wasn't technically illegal, but raised ethical questions, or something else was happening beneath the legitimate business operations. I'd built my career on asking uncomfortable questions. Numbers didn't lie, even when the people behind them did. By 5:30, my vision had started to double from screen fatigue. I saved my work, closed the laptop, and decided to explore the estate before dinner. The mansion was sprawling, with multiple wings radiating from a central rotunda topped by a stained glass dome. I'd been given a guest suite in the east wing, a space larger than my entire apartment, with a 4-poster bed and an ensuite bathroom that featured a soaking tub and separate rainfall shower. The luxury was wasted on me. I'd probably work until midnight and collapse into bed without appreciating any of it. Still, I was curious about the rest of the property. The estate manager's orientation that morning had been cursory, focused on showing me the business center and my sleeping quarters, without much elaboration on the mansion's layout. I wandered down hallways lined with closed doors, each presumably leading to private quarters or storage. Most were locked. The few I tested didn't budge. On the second floor of the north wing, I found what appeared to be a private library. The door stood ajar, revealing floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the kind of leather furniture that aged gracefully over generations. I stepped inside, drawn by the scent of old paper and binding glue, a smell that always reminded me of my accounting textbooks, of late nights studying for the CPA exam while working 2 part-time jobs. The books were eclectic. First editions of classic literature sat beside contemporary business theory, philosophy texts next to biographies of historical figures. Someone in this family actually read, which surprised me more than the luxury. Old money often collected books as decor without ever opening them. I was examining a signed copy of a Graham Greene novel when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, measured, male. They paused outside the library, then continued down the corridor. I checked my watch. 6:15. Still time before dinner. I should probably return to my room, change into something more appropriate for a formal meal. But as I left the library, I realized I'd gotten turned around. The north wing's layout didn't match the east wing's, and the hallways all looked similar with their matching marble floors and cream-colored walls. I tried retracing my steps, ended up at a dead end, backtracked, and found myself in front of a door that looked different from the others. Dark mahogany instead of painted white, with an ornate brass handle shaped like a lion's head. I checked my phone. 6:40. I was going to be late if I didn't find my way back soon. This door had to lead somewhere useful, maybe a shortcut to another wing. I grasped the handle and pushed. The door swung open smoothly, revealing a bedroom that made my guest suite look like a budget motel. But I barely registered the details. The 4-poster bed draped in navy silk, the fireplace with its marble mantel, the antique rug that probably cost more than my car, because my attention locked immediately on the man standing near the dresser. He was shirtless. My brain stuttered, trying to process the scene. Broad shoulders that spoke of regular gym sessions, not just genetic luck. A chest that suggested actual physical labor at some point in his life, not the soft bodies of men who spent their days behind desks. Dark hair with silver at the temples, styled back from a face that was all angles. Sharp jaw, straight nose, eyes so dark they looked black in the low light. Those eyes met mine. For a frozen moment, neither of us moved. Then his hand went to the dress shirt draped over the back of a chair, but he didn't reach for it. Didn't cover himself. Just stood there, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "I'm sorry," I managed, heat flooding my face. "I got lost. I was trying to find my way back to the east wing, and I thought this door, I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. "Close the door." The command was quiet, almost conversational, but something in his tone made my hand freeze on the doorknob. Not threatening exactly, but not a request either. I said I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I kept my back to him, unwilling to turn around and look at that chest again, at the way his muscles moved when he shifted his weight. "I know. Close the door anyway." This time, I recognized the steel beneath the silk. This wasn't a man accustomed to having his instructions ignored. And despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself pushing the door shut with a soft click. The lock turned. Not from my side. I spun around to find him much closer than he'd been, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Something with notes of cedar and bergamot, expensive and subtle. He'd moved silently across the antique rug. His hand rested on the lock mechanism above my head, effectively caging me against the door without actually touching me. "You're the auditor," he said. Not a question. "Yara Race." I lifted my chin, refusing to be intimidated despite the fact that my heart was trying to escape my ribcage. "And you're Xavier Fonseca. I was told you wouldn't be back until later this week. Plans change." His gaze traveled over my face, cataloging details with the same intensity I'd used on his financial records. "You've been asking questions about the revenue streams." How did he know that? I'd only discussed it with Wendy a few hours ago. Either the walls had ears, or the staff reported directly to him about every conversation. Both options were troubling. "That's my job, to ask questions when numbers don't reconcile." I kept my voice steady, professional. The same tone I used with hostile executives during difficult audits. "If you'd prefer to schedule a formal meeting to discuss my findings so far, I'm happy to." "No need for formality. We're having this meeting now." He still hadn't reached for his shirt. Still stood close enough that I could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more than his current serious expression indicated. "Tell me exactly what you found, Ms. Rice. Don't hedge. Don't soften it. I want your honest assessment." The accountant in me recognized a test when I saw one. He was evaluating whether I'd cave under pressure, whether I'd backpedal on my preliminary conclusions when confronted by the man whose empire I was scrutinizing. "Your ancillary revenue doesn't match any legitimate source I can identify," I said bluntly. "Large cash deposits at irregular intervals, always structured to avoid reporting thresholds. Payments to entities that don't appear to conduct actual business. Either you're engaged in aggressive tax evasion, which would require me to file a report with the regulatory authorities, or you're laundering money through the hotel properties. Possibly both." His expression didn't change, didn't flicker with surprise or anger or guilt. He just watched me with those unreadable dark eyes. "And which do you think it is?" "I think," I said carefully, "that I need access to more documentation before making a final determination. But the patterns are consistent with what I've seen in cases of organized criminal activity. Specifically, illegal gambling operations funneling cash through legitimate businesses." The silence that followed felt heavy, dangerous. I'd just accused a powerful man of serious crimes while locked in his bedroom, with no witnesses and no way out. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed that I'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then Xavier Fonseca smiled. It transformed his face completely, softening the hard edges, reaching his eyes and making them crinkle at the corners. He looked younger, almost boyish, despite the silver in his hair. You're either very brave or very foolish, Ms. Rice. Neither, just thorough. My pulse was still racing, but I held his gaze. If you're going to fire me, I'd appreciate knowing now so I can make arrangements to leave tonight. Fire you? He laughed, a low, genuine sound. Why would I do that? You're the first auditor in 5 years who's actually looked at the numbers instead of just rubber stamping the reports. I'm impressed. The compliment caught me off guard. Then you're admitting the irregularities exist? I'm admitting nothing. He finally stepped back, giving me space to breathe, crossed to the chair and picked up his shirt, sliding it on with efficient movements that still managed to be distracting. But I am curious about what you plan to do with your suspicions. File my report. That's what I was contracted to do. Even knowing it might put you in danger? He buttoned the shirt slowly, watching my reaction. People who threaten my business operations tend to experience unfortunate complications. The threat was barely veiled, but something in his delivery suggested he was testing me again, pushing to see if I'd crumble under intimidation. Then I suppose I'll have to be careful, I replied, though I'd prefer not to work under threat of violence. So if you're planning to complicate my life, I'd appreciate you being direct about it instead of cryptic. Another smile, this one with an edge of respect. Direct, I can do that. He finished with the buttons, left the shirt untucked, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Even partially dressed, he radiated an authority that had nothing to do with clothing and everything to do with absolute confidence in his power. You have 60 days on this contract. During that time, you'll continue your audit. You'll have full access to whatever records you request. But you'll also live here, on the estate, under my observation. That wasn't part of the original agreement. The original agreement didn't account for you being this competent. He moved to the fireplace, leaned against the mantel with the casual ease of someone in his own territory. I need to know whether you're working alone, or if someone sent you to dig specifically for information they can use against me. 60 days should be enough time to determine your true motives. My mouth went dry. You think I'm a spy. I think you're asking exactly the right questions, in exactly the right places, with exactly the right skills to find what you're looking for. That's either extraordinary coincidence or careful planning. His gaze pinned me in place. So we're going to spend the next 2 months getting very well acquainted, Ms. Rice. And at the end of that time, I'll decide whether you're a threat that needs to be eliminated or an asset worth protecting. The casual mention of elimination sent ice through my veins, but beneath the fear, a spark of anger ignited. I'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much to be threatened by a criminal with delusions of grandeur, no matter how well he wore his authority. And if I refuse? If I terminate the contract and leave tonight? Xavier pushed off from the mantel, closed the distance between us again. This time when he caged me against the door, his hands landed on either side of my head, his body close enough that I could feel his heat without him actually touching me. Then I'll assume you're working for my competitors, and I'll take appropriate measures to ensure you can't share what you've learned. His voice dropped to a near whisper, intimate and terrifying. But I'd prefer not to do that, because despite the circumstances of our meeting, I find myself very curious about you, Yara Rice. About whether that sharp tongue extends beyond financial analysis. About whether you're as fearless as you're pretending to be right now. My breath caught. This close, I could see flecks of amber in his dark eyes. Could smell the cedar of his cologne mixed with something warmer, more personal. My body responded against my will. A flutter of awareness low in my belly that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the raw magnetism of the man standing inches away. This is insane, I whispered. Probably. He didn't move back. But it's also non-negotiable. You walked through that door, Ms. Rice, and as I told you when you tried to leave, it's too late for that now. The question is whether you're going to make this difficult, or whether you're smart enough to see the opportunity in the situation. What opportunity? Being held prisoner by a criminal. Being protected by someone with the resources to keep you safe while you do the job you were hired to do. His gaze dropped to my mouth, then back to my eyes. And maybe learning that the world isn't as black and white as your balance sheets suggest. Before I could respond, a knock sounded at the door behind me. Xavier's expression shifted instantly, the intimacy replaced by cold authority. Yes? Dinner is served, Mr. Fonseca. Wendy's voice muffled through the wood. Shall I set a place for Ms. Rice? 2 places, he called back, still watching me. We'll be down shortly. He stepped back, finally giving me room to breathe. Straightened his shirt cuffs with precise movements, every inch the composed executive again, as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. As if he hadn't just upended my entire understanding of this contract. Fix your hair, he said, nodding toward a mirror on the wall. And try to look less like you've just been thoroughly rattled. My staff gossips. I moved to the mirror on shaking legs, saw my reflection. Flushed cheeks, dilated pupils, hair slightly mussed where I'd leaned against the door. I looked exactly like someone who'd just had an intense encounter with an attractive man. Which was ridiculous, because that's not what had happened. He'd threatened me, trapped me, made it clear I was now a prisoner, regardless of what polite euphemisms he used. And yet my hands trembled as I smoothed my hair back into place, as I straightened my blouse and tried to compose my expression into something professional. Xavier waited by the door, watching with an expression that might have been amusement. Ready? Do I have a choice? About dinner? No. About everything else? He opened the door, gestured for me to precede him into the hallway. We'll see. You have 60 days to convince me you're not a threat, Ms. Rice. I suggest you use them wisely. As I stepped past him, his hand settled at the small of my back. A gesture that could have been courteous but felt like ownership. A reminder that I was now operating in his territory, under his rules, with my freedom contingent on his judgment. The accountant in me recognized this as a spectacularly bad position to be in. Every logical cell in my body screamed that I should run, should call the authorities, should do anything except walk calmly down to dinner with a man who'd just admitted to criminal operations and threatened my life. But another part of me, the part that had always been too curious for my own good, that couldn't leave an unbalanced equation unsolved, wanted to know what else was hiding in those financial records. Wanted to understand the contradiction between the man who funded illegal gambling and the one who kept a library full of philosophy texts. Wanted to discover whether Xavier Fonseca was the villain I should fear, or something far more complicated. So I walked beside him down the marble hallway, past the oil paintings and the gold-veined floors, toward a dining room where I would share a meal with a criminal who held my fate in his hands, and tried not to think about how his touch at my back had sent electricity down my spine, or how his smile had made something dangerous and unwanted unfurl in my chest. 60 days. God help me. The formal dining room could have hosted a state dinner. A mahogany table stretched the length of the space, set with china so delicate I was afraid to breathe near it. Crystal glasses caught the light from an overhead chandelier that dripped with what I suspected were actual crystals, not glass imitations. Everything gleamed. The silverware, the serving platters, even the damask napkins folded into intricate shapes beside each plate. Only 2 places were set, at opposite ends of the absurdly long table. This seems excessive for a casual dinner, I observed, taking the seat a silent staff member pulled out for me. Xavier sat 20 feet away, far enough that we'd have to raise our voices to converse comfortably. A power play, obviously. Reminding me of the distance between us, the gulf of wealth and influence that separated a hotel magnate from a contract auditor. I don't do casual. Xavier accepted a glass of red wine from the server, swirling it with the practiced motion of someone who understood vintages. But If you'd prefer something more intimate, we can relocate to the smaller dining room after the first course." The way he said intimate made heat creep up my neck. I focused on my own wine glass, filled without my requesting it, and tried to identify the varietal by scent alone. Something French, probably Bordeaux, with notes that suggested it cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a month. I'd built my career on reading financial documents, on finding patterns in spreadsheets. But people were messier than numbers, and Xavier Fonseca was proving particularly difficult to calculate. The first course arrived, scallops arranged artistically on a bed of something green and micro-herbed that I couldn't identify. I ate mechanically, barely tasting it, my mind still churning through the implications of our earlier conversation. 60 days of confinement. 60 days of being watched, evaluated, judged for threats I might pose to his criminal empire. "Tell me about yourself, Ms. Rice." Xavier's voice carried easily down the table. "Beyond the impressive credentials, where did you grow up?" "Is this part of the investigation?" I met his gaze over the ridiculous expanse of mahogany. "Determining whether my background suggests I'm working for your competitors." "It's called conversation. People have them over meals." A slight smile played at his mouth. "Though, if you'd prefer, we can discuss the quarterly variance analysis in silence." Despite myself, I almost laughed. The absurdity of the situation was starting to hit me. Trapped in a mansion with a criminal who apparently appreciated dry humor about accounting practices. "São Paulo," I said finally. "Until I was 12. Then my parents moved us here for better opportunities." I cut into a scallop, the knife gliding through the tender flesh with barely any pressure. "My father worked in a textile factory. My mother cleaned houses. They saved everything so I could go to university instead of following them into manual labor." "And you chose accounting." "I chose security. Numbers don't lie, don't change based on mood or politics. You can build a career on being good with numbers." I took a small bite, forced myself to chew and swallow despite my lack of appetite. "Turns out you can also build a criminal enterprise on manipulating them." "Careful, Ms. Rice, your tongue is showing." But his eyes held amusement rather than anger. "Though I appreciate the consistency, you're not trying to charm your way into my good graces." "Would that work?" "No." He finished his scallops, set down his fork with precise alignment on the plate. "I've had plenty of people try to manipulate me with flattery. It's tedious. Your honesty is far more refreshing, even when it's insulting." The servers cleared our plates with the efficiency of people who'd perfected invisibility. I watched them work, noting their careful avoidance of eye contact, the way they moved through the room like ghosts. How many of them knew what Xavier really did? How many were complicit in the illegal operations funding their salaries? The second course arrived. Some kind of fish in a sauce that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. Xavier waited until the servers retreated before speaking again. "I had you investigated." He said it casually, as if discussing the weather. "Before you arrived. Standard practice for anyone with access to sensitive financial information." My hand tightened on my fork. "And? And you're exactly what you appear to be. Daughter of immigrants, worked 2 jobs through university, graduated top of your class, took the CPA exam 3 times before passing." "Twice," I interrupted. "I passed on the second attempt." He smiled. "Testing whether you're paying attention. You've worked for the same auditing firm for 8 years, received consistent excellent reviews, never married, no serious relationships lasting more than 6 months. You drive a 2014 sedan with 140 Zuzern kilometers on it and live in a 1-bedroom apartment that costs exactly 30% of your monthly income, the recommended ratio for financial stability." The level of detail made my skin crawl. "You had someone follow me." "I had someone compile publicly available information and fill in gaps through standard background checks." He cut into his fish with surgical precision. "Nothing invasive. No cameras in your apartment. No taps on your phone. Though I did find it interesting that you have no social media presence. Most people your age document every meal and thought. I prefer privacy. My appetite had vanished completely, but I forced myself to take another bite. Showing weakness felt dangerous. And I don't see how my relationship history or car payment schedule is relevant to my ability to audit your books. It's not, but it tells me who you are beyond the numbers. He set down his silverware, leaned back in his chair. You're careful, deliberate. You don't take unnecessary risks or make impulsive decisions, which makes it all the more unlikely that you'd stumble into my bedroom by accident. The shifting conversation made me choke slightly on my wine. I set down the glass carefully. I told you, I got lost. The hallways all look the same. The hallways are color-coded, cream walls in the family wing, pale blue in the guest wing, sage green in the business areas. Different carpet patterns in each section. His gaze pinned me in place. You're an auditor. You notice details for a living. So either you're lying about being lost, or you were more distracted than someone with your professional reputation should be. Heat flooded my face. He was right, of course. I should have noticed the color differences, the pattern changes. I'd been trained to observe discrepancies, to catch the small variations that revealed larger truths. But I'd been so focused on the financial puzzle, on the spreadsheets that didn't reconcile, that I'd walked through the mansion like a tourist instead of the trained investigator I was supposed to be. I was thinking about the quarterly reports, I admitted, trying to trace the cash flow patterns. I wasn't paying attention to where I was walking. Dangerous habit in unfamiliar territory. But his expression had softened slightly, as if my admission pleased him. Though it does support the theory that you're working alone rather than as part of an organized effort. A professional spy wouldn't get lost on her first day. The servers returned, clearing the second course and bringing what appeared to be palate cleansers, tiny glasses of some kind of sorbet. I stared at mine, overwhelmed by the formality of it all. I'd grown up eating rice and beans at a kitchen table with mismatched chairs. This multi-course production felt like theater, like he was deliberately emphasizing the distance between us. Why are you doing this? I asked abruptly. If you believe I'm not a threat, why not just let me complete the audit and leave? Why the confinement, the observation, the 60-day deadline? Xavier studied his sorbet glass, turning it slowly on the pristine tablecloth. Because believing you're not currently a threat and trusting you completely are different calculations. You've already proven you're competent enough to find discrepancies others missed. That makes you valuable. It also makes you dangerous. So you're keeping me prisoner until you decide which I am. I prefer to think of it as extended due diligence. He took a small spoonful of sorbet, the picture of casual elegance. Besides, you might find there are advantages to the arrangement. You wanted access to more documentation. You'll have it. Full transparency into the operations you're auditing. How many accountants get that level of cooperation? The ones who aren't being held against their will, probably. He laughed. Genuine amusement that transformed his face again. Made him look younger despite the silver threading through his dark hair. Your honesty really is remarkable. Most people in your position would be trying to appease me. Most people in my position would have run screaming when you locked that bedroom door. And yet you stayed. The amusement faded, replaced by something more intense. Why is that, Ms. Rice? If you're truly as cautious and risk-averse as your financial profile suggests, why didn't you try harder to leave? It was the question I'd been avoiding asking myself. The rational answer was self-preservation. Running might have triggered his suspicions, made him think I was guilty of the espionage he feared. But that wasn't the whole truth, and we both knew it. Curiosity, I said finally. The numbers don't add up, and I want to know why. I want to understand what you're hiding, even if understanding puts you in danger. I've spent my entire career asking questions that made powerful people uncomfortable. This isn't that different. I met his gaze across the table. Except, usually I'm not sleeping in the suspect's house. Is that what I am? A suspect? Until I see evidence otherwise, yes. The main course arrived before he could respond. Perfectly cooked steak with roasted vegetables that probably came from an organic farm with a 3-month waiting list. The wine was replaced with a different vintage, deeper and richer. Everything orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. We ate in silence for several minutes. I used the time to study him covertly, trying to reconcile the man across the table with the financial irregularities I'd found. He ate with the same precise movements he used for everything else. Controlled, deliberate, wasting no motion. His hands were surprisingly calloused for someone who supposedly spent his days in executive meetings. The kind of calluses that came from actual physical work, not just signing documents. You have questions. Xavier broke the silence without looking up from his plate. I can see you cataloging details, adding them to your mental file. Ask. Your hands. Those aren't executive calluses. He glanced at his palms, flexed his fingers slightly. I rebuild antique furniture in my spare time. There's a workshop on the grounds. I find it meditative, working with my hands instead of my mind. The detail was unexpected, too specific to be a convenient lie. I filed it away with the other contradictions. The philosophy books, the genuine laughter, the furniture restoration hobby. Xavier Fonseca was proving to be a more complicated equation than I'd anticipated. The library I found earlier. You've actually read those books. Most of them, yes, though I'm still working through the Camus collection. He took a sip of wine. Why does that surprise you? Because criminals don't usually have first editions of The Stranger sitting next to their business theory texts. Your assumptions about criminals might be more limited than you think. He set down his glass. Tell me, Ms. Rice, what do you think I'd do with the money from the ancillary revenue streams you identified? The question was a trap. Whatever I said would reveal something about my own biases, my preconceptions. But Xavier was watching me with that intense focus again, waiting to see if I'd retreat into professional neutrality or engage honestly. I think you use it to expand your legitimate operations, I said carefully. Money laundering 101. Mix dirty cash with clean revenue streams until the source becomes untraceable. The hotel empire provides perfect cover. Large cash businesses, international transactions, complex ownership structures. You could move millions without triggering automated alerts. Sound methodology. He didn't confirm or deny, just acknowledged my analysis. And what do you think motivates someone to take those risks? Simple greed? Usually, though sometimes it's more complicated. Power, legacy, revenge. People build criminal empires for all sorts of reasons. I pushed vegetables around my plate. Appetite still absent. Does it matter why, when the result is the same? Illegal operations that harm communities and fund violence. It matters if you're trying to understand the full picture instead of reducing complex situations to binary moral judgments. There was an edge to his voice now, the first sign of real emotion beneath his controlled exterior. But that's a conversation for another night. You look exhausted. He was right. The adrenaline from our earlier confrontation had faded, leaving me hollow and shaky. Between the travel, the hours hunched over spreadsheets, and the shock of discovering I was essentially a prisoner, my body was starting to shut down. I'd like to return to my room, I said, unless you plan to interrogate me over dessert. No interrogation, just dessert if you'd like it, though I suspect you'd rather sleep. He signaled to the servers, who materialized instantly. Klaus will escort you back to the guest wing. Your laptop and files have been moved to a secure office where you can work without being disturbed. Klaus turned out to be the head of security, a solid man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who'd served in military or law enforcement. He nodded politely, but didn't speak as he led me through the mansion's corridors. This time I paid attention to the color coding Xavier had mentioned, noting the transition from cream to pale blue as we entered the guest wing. My suite looked untouched, but I knew it had been searched. Nothing obvious. My toiletries were still arranged on the bathroom counter, my suitcase still half unpacked on the luggage rack. But the subtle differences were there for someone trained to notice them. Clothes folded slightly differently than I'd left them. Shoes aligned at a marginally different angle. Whoever had searched had been professional, thorough, and trying to be discreet about it. I checked my phone instinctively, though I knew it was pointless. No signal. The estate either blocked cellular service or was located far enough from towers that reception was impossible. My laptop had indeed been moved. Klaus indicated a door I hadn't noticed earlier, leading to a small office equipped with a desk, ergonomic chair, and multiple monitors. "Mr. Fonseca said you'd have everything you need to continue your work," Klaus explained in accented English. German, I thought. "The system is secure, isolated from external networks. You'll have access to all requested files through the internal database. Isolated meaning I can't email anyone or access the internet. For security purposes, yes." His expression remained professionally neutral. Mr. Fonseca's instructions were clear. You have everything necessary to complete your audit, but external communication is restricted. After Klaus left, I locked the door and leaned against it, finally allowing myself to process the full weight of my situation. I was trapped. No phone service, no internet, no way to contact my supervisor or the authorities. Xavier Fonseca controlled every aspect of my environment, from the food I ate to the air I breathed. The rational part of my brain screamed that I should be terrified. And I was, to some extent. But beneath the fear, that traitorous curiosity burned stronger. What was he hiding that required this level of security? What would I find if I had the full financial picture? I moved to the office, powered on the main monitor. The system booted to a custom interface, no operating system Chrome, just a clean database management screen. I navigated through the directory structure, found folders organized by property, by year, by transaction type. Someone had granted me comprehensive access, just as Xavier promised. I opened the most recent quarterly report for the flagship hotel property, started tracing individual transactions, following the money through accounts and transfers. The patterns I'd noticed earlier became clearer with more data. Large cash deposits always on different days, never establishing a predictable schedule. Withdrawals that corresponded to payments to shell companies. But also, I leaned closer to the screen, rechecking my analysis. There were additional transfers I hadn't noticed in the preliminary review. Large sums moving out of the shell company accounts into what appeared to be charitable foundations. Educational scholarships, specifically. For students from low-income neighborhoods, funded through organizations with names like Future Leaders Foundation and Community Scholars Initiative. The amounts were staggering. Millions of dollars annually, flowing from the suspicious revenue streams into legitimate charitable causes. It didn't make sense from a money laundering perspective. You wanted to move dirty money into assets you controlled, not give it away to strangers. Unless the point wasn't just laundering money. Unless Xavier Fonseca was using illegal gambling profits to fund educational opportunities for kids who reminded him of someone. I sat back in the ergonomic chair, mind racing. This complicated everything. Criminals weren't supposed to be philanthropists. They weren't supposed to rebuild antique furniture, or keep philosophy books, or create scholarship funds for disadvantaged youth. But the numbers didn't lie, and what they were telling me was that Xavier Fonseca had built a criminal empire specifically to generate funds he then distributed to communities that traditional financial systems ignored. It was still illegal, still technically wrong, but it was also far more morally complex than simple greed. I needed to understand why. Not for the audit, the numbers themselves were clear enough, but for my own comprehension of the man who'd locked me in his bedroom and then served me a 7-course dinner while discussing Camus. A soft knock at my bedroom door made me jump. I glanced at the clock, past midnight. Who would be knocking at this hour? I cracked the door open to find Wendy standing in the hallway, looking uncomfortable. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late, Ms. Rice, but Mr. Fonseca asked me to give you this." She handed me a sealed envelope, heavy paper with my name written in precise handwriting across the front. I waited until she left before opening it. Inside, a single page, handwritten. "Ms. Rice. You're wondering why someone would build an illegal operation to fund charitable work instead of simply donating through legitimate channels. The answer is simple. Legitimate channels require questions, paperwork, committees that decide who is deserving of help. They move slowly and help selectively. I learned young that people like my family, immigrants, poor, without connections, don't qualify as deserving by traditional standards. We fall through the cracks. So I built a system that doesn't ask questions, doesn't require proof of worthiness, doesn't make children wait while bureaucrats debate their potential. Illegal? Yes. Wrong? That's a more complicated calculation. Think about it while you review the scholarship disbursements, and understand that if you expose this operation, you won't just be ending my business. You'll be ending opportunities for thousands of students who have no other options. Sleep well. X. F. I read the letter 3 times, then locked it in my briefcase with the financial documents I'd printed earlier. The man was manipulating me, of course, presenting his criminal activities as noble Robin Hood redistribution instead of the felonies they actually were. But he was also telling me something true about himself, something that explained the philosophy books and the furniture restoration and the careful way he'd watched me across the dinner table. Xavier Fonseca saw himself as a solution to systemic failures. And whether I agreed with his methods or not, I couldn't deny that the results, those scholarship disbursements, those changed lives, were real. I returned to the office, pulled up the Scholarship Foundation files, and began to read. Student names, amounts awarded, schools attended, success stories documented in careful detail, first-generation college graduates, professional certifications, graduate degrees, hundreds of lives altered by money that originated in illegal gambling operations. Somewhere around 3 a.m, I finally admitted to myself what I'd known since finding those first discrepancies in the revenue streams. This wasn't a simple audit anymore. This was a choice about what kind of justice mattered more, the letter of the law or the lives being changed by breaking it. And I had 58 days to figure out which side of that equation I stood on. The workshop sat at the edge of the estate grounds, a converted carriage house with high ceilings and windows that let in the kind of natural light photographers paid premium rates to capture. I found it on my 3rd day of confinement, during one of my supervised walks with Klaus, trailing at a respectful distance. Mr. Fonseca doesn't usually allow guests in his workspace, Klaus observed when I paused at the entrance, drawn by the scent of wood shavings and varnish. Then maybe you should stop me. I tested the door, unlocked. Or you could pretend you didn't notice me wandering off the approved path. Klaus's expression remained neutral, but he didn't physically restrain me when I pushed the door open. I took that as tacit permission. The interior was organized chaos. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools that ranged from modern power equipment to antique hand planes that looked like they belonged in a museum. Several pieces of furniture in various stages of restoration occupied the central space. A writing desk missing its veneer, chairs with broken spindles, a small table stripped down to bare wood. Xavier stood at one of the benches, focused on a delicate piece of inlay work. He'd traded his usual tailored shirts for worn jeans and a t-shirt dusted with sawdust, his hair slightly disheveled. The casual attire made him look younger, less like the intimidating executive from our first encounter, and more like someone who might actually read philosophy for pleasure. He glanced up when I entered, surprise flickering across his features before being replaced by that familiar controlled expression. "Ms. Rice, looking for something?" Answers. I moved closer to the workbench, examining the piece he was restoring, an ornate jewelry box with mother-of-pearl inlay in a geometric pattern. I've been reviewing the Scholarship Foundation files. I have questions. I'm sure you do. He set down the tiny chisel he'd been using, brushing sawdust from his hands. But this isn't the time or place for a formal discussion. You told me I'd have full access to documentation. That includes understanding the rationale behind financial decisions. I picked up one of the loose pieces of mother-of-pearl, turning it in the light. Why use illegal gambling revenue instead of simply donating through your legitimate hotel profits? Xavier leaned against the workbench, studying me with that intense focus I was beginning to recognize as his default setting when something genuinely interested him. You read my letter? 3 times. It doesn't actually answer the question. I set down the inlay piece carefully. Your hotel empire generates substantial legitimate profits. You could establish scholarship funds through normal charitable channels without any criminal exposure. So why take the risk? Because normal charitable channels are designed to maintain existing power structures, not disrupt them. He moved to a small refrigerator in the corner, retrieved 2 bottles of water, handed me one. Legitimate foundations require applicants to prove worthiness through grades, test scores, essays describing their hardships in ways that appeal to wealthy donors. They perpetuate the myth that poverty is a personal failing rather than a systemic issue. I twisted the cap off the water bottle, considering his words. As someone who'd written exactly those kinds of essays to pay for university, describing my parents' sacrifices, my determination to overcome circumstances, I understood the degradation he was describing. The way poverty became a performance for the comfort of people who'd never experienced it. That's a criticism of the system, not a justification for breaking the law. Isn't it? He took a long drink of water, his throat working. I forced myself to look away from the unconsciously attractive motion. If the legal system is designed to preserve inequality, isn't circumventing it a moral imperative rather than a crime? That's the kind of rationalization every criminal uses to justify their behavior. Perhaps. Or perhaps some systems are so fundamentally broken that working within them is complicity. He set down his water bottle, moved back to the jewelry box. My father worked in construction, 16-hour days, paid under the table, no benefits or protections. When he fell from scaffolding and shattered his spine, the contractor denied he'd ever employed him. My father died waiting for compensation that never came, unable to afford the medical care that might have saved him. The personal revelation caught me off guard. Xavier had been careful to keep our interactions professional, revealing nothing about his history beyond what was necessary to explain his business operations. This felt different, rawer, more honest. I'm sorry. The words were inadequate, but genuine. How old were you? 15. My mother cleaned houses, worked herself into early graves trying to support 3 children alone. My older brother dropped out of school to help, ended up in a factory accident that cost him his right hand. Xavier's fingers moved over the jewelry box with practiced precision, the kind of muscle memory that came from years of repetition. The system didn't care about any of us. We were expendable. So I decided to build something that would care, even if it required operating outside legal boundaries. I processed this information, adding it to the growing file of contradictions that comprised Xavier Fonseca. The gambling operations. When did you start them? 20 years ago. Small at first. Illegal card games in the back of a restaurant, sports betting through offshore accounts. I had a talent for understanding odds, for managing risk. A slight smile crossed his face. Not unlike auditing, actually. Both require seeing patterns others miss. Except auditing is legal. Legal and effective are different calculations. He picked up a piece of inlay, examining it against the light. I could have gone into legitimate finance, used conventional methods to accumulate wealth. But that would have taken decades. And in the meantime, kids like I'd been would continue falling through cracks in the system. The illegal approach provided capital quickly, allowed me to start making a difference immediately. By becoming exactly the kind of criminal who perpetuates the poverty cycle you claim to oppose. His jaw tightened. The people who use my gambling services are wealthy executives looking for thrills, not desperate families betting their rent money. I provide exclusive, high-stakes games for clients who can afford to lose. That's a significant moral distinction from predatory neighborhood operations. It's still illegal, still criminal enterprise, regardless of how you frame the clientele. I moved to examine one of the other furniture pieces, a small table with intricate carved legs. And at some point, maintaining that empire requires more than just running card games. It requires enforcement, violence, eliminating competition. You've been watching too many movies. But something in his expression suggested I'd hit close to a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. I'm not a violent man, Ms. Rice. I've built my operations on discretion and mutual benefit, not intimidation. What about competitors? Other organizations that want access to your wealthy clientele? Xavier set down the inlay piece with more force than necessary. I handle competition through superior service and reputation, not through violence. Though I won't pretend the world I operate in doesn't include dangerous people. It does. Which is part of why I need to be certain about your loyalties before allowing you to leave. We'd circled back to the central issue. My confinement. His paranoia about my potential connections to rivals. I took a deep breath, choosing my next words carefully. I'm not working for anyone except the auditing firm that hired me. You've had me investigated, searched my room, isolated me from external communication. If I were a spy, you'd have found evidence by now, or you're exceptionally well trained. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell sawdust and that cedar cologne, could see the fine lines around his eyes that deepened when he concentrated. The problem with trust, Ms. Rice, is that it requires vulnerability, and vulnerability in my world tends to have fatal consequences. Then why tell me any of this? I gestured at the workshop around us, at the tools and furniture, and the casual domesticity of the space. Why show me your father's history, your motivations? If you truly believed I was a threat, you'd maintain professional distance instead of personal revelation. Xavier studied me for a long moment, his dark eyes searching my face for something I couldn't identify. Because despite my better judgment, I find myself wanting you to understand. Not just the business operations, but the reasons behind them. The admission hung between us, charged with implications neither of us seemed ready to examine. I became suddenly, acutely aware of how close we were standing, of the way his gaze kept dropping to my mouth before returning to my eyes. I should get back to the audit, I said, my voice not quite steady. I have questions about the quarterly variance in the Atlantic City property revenue. Of course. But he didn't step back, didn't give me space to retreat. Though I was hoping you might stay a while longer. I find I work better with company, and you ask more interesting questions than most people I talk to. Questions about your criminal enterprise. Questions about the choices people make when existing systems fail them. He reached past me to retrieve another tool from the bench, his arm brushing mine in a contact that felt deliberate despite its brevity. There's a difference. Against my better judgment, I found myself staying. Watching as he returned to the delicate inlay work, explaining the process with the same precision he'd used to describe his financial operations. The jewelry box was a commission, apparently. A gift for someone's anniversary, reproducing a piece that had been damaged in a house fire. Why do this yourself? I asked, genuinely curious. You could hire craftsmen, have someone else restore furniture while you focus on running your empire. Because this, he gestured at the workbench, the tools, the partially restored pieces, is honest work. Creating something beautiful from damaged materials, using skill and patience rather than money or influence. It reminds me that not everything worth doing can be delegated or bought. The philosophy surprised me, though it probably shouldn't have. Everything about Xavier contained contradictions. Criminal and philanthropist, ruthless businessman and careful craftsman, threatening captor, and surprisingly thoughtful conversationalist. We worked in comfortable silence for nearly an hour. He focused on the jewelry box, while I examined the other furniture pieces, noting the care taken with each restoration. Some of the pieces looked like they'd been salvaged from estate sales or demolitions, the kind of furniture wealthy families discarded when trends changed, not realizing the craftsmanship they were abandoning. "You save things other people throw away," I observed, running my fingers along the carved leg of the small table. Furniture, students, business opportunities. Is that a pattern or a coincidence? Xavier glanced up from his work, a slight smile playing at his mouth. "You're very observant, Ms. Rice. Has anyone told you that?" "It's literally my job. I find patterns in financial data." I moved to another piece, a dining chair with a broken back slat. Though usually the patterns involve fraud, not philosophical consistency. And which am I? Fraudster or philosopher? Both. That's the problem. I met his gaze across the workshop. "You've built something genuinely impactful with the scholarship programs. The student outcomes are impressive. Higher graduation rates than traditional scholarship recipients, better career placement, stronger community engagement. From a pure results perspective, your system works better than the legal alternatives." I sense a but coming, but it's still built on illegal gambling operations, which means it's unsustainable, vulnerable to law enforcement exposure, and puts everyone involved at risk. I moved back to the workbench where he stood, including the students who benefit from it. What happens to their scholarships if you're arrested? If your assets are frozen during prosecution? Something flickered in his expression. Not anger, but perhaps respect for the challenge. I've structured the foundations as independent entities with their own endowments. Even if my operations were completely dismantled, the scholarships would continue for at least 15 years. 15 years isn't forever. And what about new students? The ones who won't have access to your system because it's been shut down? Then I suppose we'd better make sure it doesn't get shut down. He set down his tools, giving me his full attention. Which brings us back to your role in this situation, Ms. Rice. You now have comprehensive knowledge of my operations, my motivations, and my vulnerabilities. What do you plan to do with that information? The question I'd been avoiding since finding the scholarship disbursements. The choice between legal obligation and moral complexity, between following rules and protecting outcomes. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Part of me thinks I should report everything to the authorities, let the legal system handle it. But another part recognizes that would destroy something genuinely beneficial, harm students who've done nothing wrong except accept help from a questionable source." Welcome to moral ambiguity, Ms. Rice. It's less comfortable than binary thinking, but considerably more honest about how the world actually works. Don't patronize me. The sharpness in my voice surprised both of us. I'm not naive about systemic failures or the limitations of legal frameworks. I grew up watching my parents work themselves to exhaustion for wages that barely covered rent. I know exactly how the system fails people. But I also know that justifying criminal behavior through noble intentions is how corruption spreads. Xavier's expression shifted, not defensive but engaged, as if he genuinely wanted to understand my perspective. "So, what's your alternative? Accept that the system is broken and do nothing? Work within legal channels that move too slowly to help people who need immediate assistance?" I don't have an alternative yet. That's the point. I leaned against the workbench, suddenly exhausted. You've put me in an impossible position. If I report your operations, I harm innocent students. If I don't, I become complicit in criminal activity. There's no clean choice. Life rarely offers clean choices, just varying degrees of compromise. He moved closer, his voice softening. For what it's worth, I didn't intend to make this personal. The audit was supposed to be straightforward. You'd review the books, find what you found, and I'd determine appropriate next steps based on your response. But then you walked into my bedroom, and everything became more complicated. Because you think I might be working for competitors. Because I realized I wanted you to understand. His hand lifted, hovering near my face before dropping back to his side. Not agree, necessarily, but understand the calculus that led me here. Why does my understanding matter? I'm not entirely sure. The admission seemed to cost him something. But it does. The air between us felt charged, dangerous. I was acutely aware of how close we were standing, of the sawdust caught in his dark hair, of the way his t-shirt clung to his shoulders. This wasn't the intimidating executive from our first encounter, or even the controlled host from dinner. This was something rawer, more human. I should go, I said, not moving. Klaus will wonder where I've disappeared to. Klaus knows where you are. I told him to give you space to explore. Xavier's gaze held mine. Unless you want to leave, then I won't stop you. It was the first time he'd offered me genuine agency since locking that bedroom door 3 days ago. I could walk out of the workshop, return to my suite, maintain professional distance while I figured out what to do about the impossible choice he'd presented. But I didn't move. Tell me about the first student you helped, I said instead. The one who made you realize this system could work. Xavier's expression softened. Her name was Kiara. Brilliant mathematician, perfect scores, but her family couldn't afford university fees even with traditional financial aid. She was planning to work full-time and attend night classes, a path that usually means dropping out within 2 years. He moved to a cabinet, withdrew a framed photograph. She graduated summa cum laude, now has a PhD in applied mathematics, teaches at a prestigious university. Last year, she established her own scholarship fund for students from her old neighborhood. The photograph showed a young woman in academic regalia, beaming at the camera with Xavier standing beside her, both of them looking genuinely happy. It was the first time I'd seen him smile that way, unguarded and proud. How many Kiaras have there been? I asked quietly. 347 full scholarships over 20 years. Hundreds more receiving partial support. He set down the photograph carefully. Not all of them succeed, of course. Some drop out, some struggle, some make poor choices, but the success rate is nearly double that of traditional scholarship programs, and the community impact is measurable. Because you don't require them to perform their poverty for donors. You just give them resources and get out of the way. Exactly. He met my gaze. Which is why I need you to understand what's at stake, Ms. Rice. This isn't about protecting my criminal enterprise or my personal wealth. It's about continuing to help students who have no other options. The emotional manipulation was obvious, but that didn't make it ineffective. He was asking me to weigh abstract legal principles against concrete human outcomes, to choose between being right and doing good. I need time, I said finally. Time to review all the documentation, to understand the full scope of operations, to think through the implications. You have 55 more days. And then what? You decide whether I'm trustworthy enough to release or whether I need to be permanently silenced. I haven't decided yet. But his expression suggested the possibility disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. Though I'm beginning to think the binary framework might be inadequate for this situation as well. Meaning? Meaning perhaps there are options beyond release or silence. Perhaps we could find a third path that protects both the operations and your integrity. The suggestion hung between us, fraught with implications. A third path would require trust, cooperation, compromise. It would mean becoming something more than auditor and subject, more than captor and captive. It would mean choosing to stay when I could potentially leave. "I'll think about it," I said, moving toward the workshop door. "But Xavier, if you're asking me to consider compromise, you need to extend the same courtesy, which means answering my questions honestly, not just presenting carefully curated information designed to manipulate my response." He didn't deny the manipulation, just nodded slowly. "Fair enough, though I should warn you. Honest answers might be harder to hear than comfortable lies. I'm an auditor. I deal in uncomfortable truths for a living." As I left the workshop, Klaus falling into step behind me for the walk back to the main house, I felt the weight of the choice settling onto my shoulders. 55 days to understand a criminal empire built on good intentions. 55 days to decide whether justice meant upholding legal frameworks or protecting the people those frameworks failed. 55 days to figure out why Xavier Fonseca's opinion of me had started to matter more than my professional obligations. And no clear answer to any of it. The office Xavier provided became my sanctuary and my prison. State-of-the-art monitors displayed financial data with crystalline clarity. Ergonomic furniture supported my body through 12-hour work sessions. Climate control maintained perfect temperature regardless of the weather outside. Everything designed for maximum productivity, maximum comfort, maximum isolation from the world beyond the estate grounds. I'd been confined for 17 days when the roses arrived. Not a bouquet. That would have been too simple, too conventional. Instead, someone had placed a single perfect bloom in a bud vase on my desk, deep red petals still beaded with morning dew. No card, no explanation. Just the flower and its subtle fragrance cutting through the sterile air of the office. "Mr. Fonseca's instructions," Wendy explained when I asked. "He noticed you looking at the garden during your morning walk yesterday. Thought you might appreciate having some of it indoors." The gesture was thoughtful in a way that made me uncomfortable. Flowers were romantic, personal, inappropriate for the bizarre professional relationship Xavier and I were navigating. But they were also beautiful, and I'd spent so much time staring at spreadsheets that the splash of color felt like water in a desert. I kept the rose. The next morning brought a different bloom, this time a pale pink peony, its layers of petals unfurling in the warmth of the office. By the end of the week, I had 7 vases arranged across the workspace, a garden of singular flowers that transformed the sterile environment into something softer. "You're collecting quite the display," Xavier observed during one of our increasingly frequent conversations. He'd taken to stopping by the office in the evenings, ostensibly to answer questions about the financial data. But really, I suspected, because he enjoyed the verbal sparring that had become our default interaction. "Someone keeps leaving them." I gestured at the latest edition, an unusual orchid with petals the color of sunset. "I suspect corporate espionage. Someone trying to soften me up through strategic floral gifts." "Is it working?" "The flowers are lovely. My opinion of criminal enterprises remains unchanged." He smiled, settling into the chair across from my desk with the ease of someone completely comfortable in his own space. He ditched the formal attire again, dark jeans and a charcoal Henley that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. Silver glinted at his temples where the overhead lights caught his hair. "I've been reviewing the Atlantic City property records," I said, pulling up a spreadsheet on the main monitor. "The revenue streams show interesting patterns during major sporting events. Football playoffs, boxing matches, championship games, all corresponding with significant cash deposits 3 to 5 days after. High-stakes betting among wealthy spectators." Xavier leaned back in his chair. "Some clients prefer the excitement of live events. We provide private boxes, secure wagering, immediate payouts for winners. Private boxes at professional sporting venues. That requires significant connections with stadium management. I provide valuable services to people who can afford discretion. They reciprocate with access. He said it casually, as if bribing venue officials was equivalent to networking at charity galas. The relationship is mutually beneficial. I made notes in the audit file, documenting the admission. And when someone can't afford their losses, what happens to clients who bet beyond their means? We screen potential customers carefully. Net worth verification, credit checks, sometimes background investigations. If someone can't demonstrate they could absorb a worst-case scenario loss, they don't get access to our services. How ethical of you, a criminal enterprise with responsible lending practices. Mock if you want, but it's good business. Desperate clients make poor decisions, attract unwanted attention from law enforcement and family members. We prefer customers who treat gambling as entertainment rather than financial strategy. The pragmatism was typical of Xavier's approach. Criminal activity managed with corporate efficiency. Illegal operations run according to sound business principles. It would have been easier to condemn if it weren't so internally consistent. I've also noticed the Scholarship Foundation endowments have grown significantly over the past 5 years, I continued, switching to a different data set. You're putting more money into education funding than you're keeping for personal expenses. Personal expenses are modest. I don't need a yacht or a private jet. The hotel properties provide comfortable living, the workshop keeps me occupied, and the scholarship funds serve their purpose. He leaned forward, interest sharpening his expression. Why? Does that surprise you? It contradicts the typical criminal profile. Most people engaged in illegal revenue generation do it for personal enrichment, not philanthropic redistribution. Most people haven't watched their father die from preventable injuries because the system valued profit over human life. There was an edge to his voice now, controlled anger beneath the surface calm. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. What would I do with more? Buy paintings I don't have time to appreciate? Vacation homes I'd never visit? At some point, accumulation becomes pathological rather than practical. So you break the law to fund scholarship programs you could support through legitimate means. We've had this conversation. But his tone was patient rather than irritated, as if he recognized we needed to revisit the central argument repeatedly before I could fully process it. Legitimate means require navigating bureaucracies designed to limit access, justify denials, maintain existing power structures. My system bypasses those barriers. Your system is also vulnerable to prosecution, asset seizure, and eventual collapse. I pulled up another file, law enforcement statistics on gambling operation busts, conviction rates, average sentences. The DEA reports a 92% conviction rate for organized illegal gambling. Once you're on their radar, it's only a matter of time before everything unravels. Xavier studied the statistics with the same calm focus he brought to everything else. And how long do you estimate I have before that happens? Based on the operational security measures you've implemented? Probably 5 to 7 years before someone makes a mistake significant enough to trigger serious investigation. I met his gaze. But it only takes one error. One disgruntled employee, one client who gets caught in an unrelated investigation and offers information to reduce their sentence. One financial institution that decides to run more thorough analysis on suspicious transfers. Hence why I'm careful about who has access to sensitive information. He said it lightly, but the reminder was clear. I now possessed exactly the kind of knowledge that could trigger the collapse I'd just described. We both let the implication hang in the air for a moment. I've made a decision, I said finally, about my preliminary audit findings. Xavier's expression didn't change, but I saw his shoulders tense slightly, his hands still where they'd been moving. Go on. I'm going to file a report stating that I found irregularities requiring further investigation, but that I need additional time to determine whether those irregularities constitute criminal activity or merely aggressive tax optimization. I pulled up the draft report I'd been working on. That gives you time to make changes, to potentially transition to more sustainable funding models, to prepare for eventual scrutiny. And what do you get in return for this professional compromise? Continued access to the full financial picture. Documentation of the scholarship program's outcomes. Evidence that the illegal revenue is genuinely being used for charitable purposes, rather than personal enrichment. I met his gaze steadily. And your word that you'll consider legitimate alternatives if I can identify viable options. You want to help me go straight? There was amusement in his voice, but also something that might have been genuine interest. Why? Because shutting you down immediately helps no one except prosecutors building their conviction statistics. The students lose funding, the communities lose support, and you lose your freedom, all without addressing the systemic failures that made your operation seem necessary in the first place. I gestured at the scholarship files displayed across multiple monitors. But if I can document that your primary motivation is genuinely philanthropic, rather than profit-driven, that might provide leverage for negotiating reduced charges if prosecution eventually becomes unavoidable. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, studying me with that intense focus that still made my pulse quicken, despite my best efforts to remain professionally detached. "You're trying to protect me," he said finally. "Why?" The question was more complicated than he probably realized. Part of it was genuinely about the scholarship programs, about preserving something beneficial. But I couldn't deny that another part, a part I was increasingly uncomfortable acknowledging, was about Xavier himself. About the contradiction between the criminal and the craftsman, about the man who sent me flowers and discussed philosophy and looked at me like I was a puzzle worth solving. "I'm trying to protect the students," I corrected. "You're just collateral benefit." Liar. But he smiled when he said it, the expression transforming his face into something warm and genuinely amused. Though I appreciate the professional fiction, it maintains plausible deniability. So, speaking of professional obligations, I changed the subject before we ventured into territory I wasn't ready to examine. I need to understand the full scope of your operations, not just the gambling, but any other revenue streams that might be legally questionable. Xavier's smile faded. Why? Because if I'm going to help you find legitimate alternatives, I need to know what I'm working with. Comprehensive financial picture, complete operational overview, full disclosure of risk factors. That's a significant amount of trust you're asking for. You locked me in your bedroom, searched my belongings, isolated me from external communication, and monitored my every movement for 17 days. I raised an eyebrow. I think we're past the point of tentative trust. He laughed, genuine surprised laughter that echoed in the quiet office. Fair point. Though I should warn you, full disclosure includes information that might change how you see me. Things that are harder to rationalize than illegal gambling for wealthy clients. Try me. Xavier stood, moved to the window that overlooked the estate grounds. Moonlight silvered his profile, emphasized the strong lines of his jaw, and the slight crook in his nose that suggested it had been broken at some point. The gambling operations are profitable, but they're not the primary revenue source, he began quietly. Most of the money comes from what we call conflict resolution services. Wealthy individuals and corporations hire us to solve problems that can't be addressed through legal channels. My stomach tightened. What kind of problems? Corporate espionage retrieval, discrete evidence collection for divorce proceedings, locating assets that have been hidden through complex offshore arrangements, occasionally convincing recalcitrant business partners to honor contractual obligations. He turned to face me. Nothing violent before you ask. My reputation is built on achieving results through leverage and information, not intimidation or force. That's still extortion. That's providing services legal systems fail to offer. When someone steals intellectual property and hides behind international jurisdictions that don't honor patent claims, what recourse does the victim have? When a corrupt executive loots a pension fund and moves assets to countries without extradition treaties, who helps the employees he defrauded? Xavier's voice remained calm, but intensity burned beneath the surface. I fill gaps in justice, Ms. Rice. Legal justice, yes, but justice nonetheless. I processed this information, adding it to the growing complexity of Xavier Fonseca's operations. Private investigation, corporate intelligence, asset recovery, all operating in gray areas between legal and illegal, all serving clients who couldn't or wouldn't use traditional channels. How many of these conflict resolution cases result in your clients recovering stolen assets or achieving their objectives? Approximately 85% success rate over the past decade. There was unmistakable pride in his voice, significantly higher than traditional legal proceedings, and resolved in fraction of the time. And the other 15%? Sometimes the opposition has better resources or more effective counter-strategies. Sometimes the requested outcome isn't achievable within the ethical boundaries I maintain. He moved back to the desk, settled into his chair. I don't accept every case. I turn away clients who want me to facilitate actual criminal activity rather than respond to it. How noble. A criminal with ethical standards. Mock all you want, but those standards are why I've operated successfully for 20 years without prosecution. Xavier leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The moment I cross certain lines, violence, genuine extortion, anything involving vulnerable populations, I become indistinguishable from the criminals I claim to be counterbalancing. The distinction matters. To whom? Your conscience or your risk management strategy? Both. He held my gaze. I told you honest answers would be harder to hear than comfortable lies. This is what I actually do, Yara. Not just run card games for board executives. I solve problems that traditional systems can't or won't address, using methods that exist in legal gray areas. And yes, I profit from it. But I also provide genuine value to clients who have exhausted legitimate options. The use of my first name, the first time he'd used it outside of written correspondence, sent an unexpected flutter through my chest. I ignored it, focused on the information he'd just revealed. I need to see case files, documented examples of these conflict resolution services, including client outcomes and methods employed. That's highly sensitive information. Client confidentiality is fundamental to the business model. I don't need names or identifying details, just operational documentation proving you're doing what you claim, helping legitimate victims rather than facilitating criminal activity. I pulled up a fresh spreadsheet. If you want me to help you find legal alternatives, I need to understand what you're actually providing that legal services can't match. Xavier was quiet for several heartbeats, clearly weighing the risk of disclosure against the potential benefit of my assistance. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'll have Klaus bring you redacted case files tomorrow. Examples across different service categories, outcomes documented, methods detailed. He stood, signaling the end of our conversation. But Yara, once you see those files, you'll have comprehensive knowledge of my entire operation. There's no walking that back. I know. And you're certain you want that level of involvement? That degree of complicity? I should have said no. Should have maintained professional distance. Stuck to the financial audit without diving deeper into the operational mechanics. But curiosity had always been my weakness, and Xavier Fonseca was the most complex equation I'd ever encountered. I'm certain, I said. Something shifted in his expression. Satisfaction, perhaps, or maybe relief. He moved toward the office door, then paused with his hand on the frame. The roses, he said without turning around. Do you like them? They're lovely. I have a garden on the south side of the property. Heirloom varieties, some over 100 years old. I thought you might enjoy walking through it sometime, if you're interested. It was as close to a personal invitation as he'd offered, carefully framed as casual suggestion rather than command. I could refuse, maintain professional boundaries, stick to our established pattern of business discussions in neutral spaces. I'd like that, I heard myself say. Xavier glanced back over his shoulder, and the smile that crossed his face made my breath catch. Not the controlled professional expression or the amused smirk from our verbal sparring. Something genuine and warm and almost vulnerable. Tomorrow, then, after you've reviewed the case files. He stepped into the hallway, then added, "Sleep well, Yara." After he left, I sat in the quiet office surrounded by flowers and financial data, trying to understand what had just happened. I'd crossed a line tonight, not just professionally, but personally. Agreed to deeper involvement, committed to helping rather than just documenting, used his first name and allowed him to use mine. Somewhere in the past 17 days, Xavier had stopped being just an audit subject and started becoming something more complicated, someone whose opinion mattered, whose motivations I genuinely wanted to understand, whose smile made something warm and dangerous unfurl in my chest. I was 30 years old, professionally trained in objective analysis, experienced at maintaining emotional distance from audit subjects. I knew better than to develop personal feelings for someone I was investigating. But knowing better and acting accordingly were different calculations, as Xavier would probably say. And I was increasingly uncertain which mattered more, professional integrity, or the possibility that maybe, just maybe, justice was more complicated than legal compliance. 43 days left to figure it out. God help me. The rose garden exceeded every expectation I'd carefully not allowed myself to have. Hidden behind high stone walls on the estate's southern border, it sprawled across nearly an acre of carefully tended beds, arranged in geometric patterns that suggested French formal design. Hundreds of varieties bloomed in a riot of colors: crimson and coral, butter yellow and pure white, deep purple that was almost black in the morning shadows. Xavier walked slightly ahead of me along the gravel paths, naming varieties with the same precision he brought to financial discussions. "This is Madame Alfred Carrière, climbing rose from 1879, very fragrant. The deep red over there is Prospero, David Austin hybrid from the 1980s. And that unusual striped one is Ferdinand Pichard, bred in 1921. You know the pedigree of every plant." I stopped to examine the striped rose more closely, admiring the precise pink and crimson stripes across each petal. This isn't just a hobby. This is a serious collection. Heirloom roses are living history. Some of these varieties survived wars, economic collapses, changes in fashion and taste. They persist because people cared enough to preserve them. He bent to deadhead a spent bloom with careful fingers. I find that admirable. Resilience through deliberate maintenance rather than aggressive adaptation. The metaphor wasn't subtle. Xavier saw himself in these roses. Old-world values persisting through careful cultivation. Traditional approaches maintained despite changing times. It explained a lot about his operations, actually. The insistence on personal codes of conduct, the rejection of violence, the focus on helping, rather than exploiting. "Klaus tells me you spend hours out here," I said, continuing along the path. The morning sun was warm on my shoulders, the air thick with rose fragrance. Early mornings before anyone else is awake. I find it meditative. The work is simple, repetitive, productive. Deadheading, pruning, checking for disease or pests. It quiets the mind. He glanced at me, a slight smile playing at his mouth. "Though Klaus shouldn't be discussing my schedule with you. I'll have to speak with him about professional discretion." "Don't. He's the only person who actually talks to me beyond polite service responses." I stopped at a bench, positioned to overlook the entire garden, sat down, despite Xavier's look of surprise. Everyone else treats me like I'm fragile or dangerous or both. Klaus at least makes normal conversation. Xavier settled beside me, maintaining careful distance on the bench. "What do you talk about?" "His daughter, mostly. She's studying engineering at university, first in his family to attend. He's incredibly proud, but trying not to hover too obviously." I smiled at the memory of Klaus showing me photos on his phone, his gruff demeanor softening when he talked about her achievements. He also has opinions about proper coffee preparation that would make baristas weep. Klaus is particular about many things. It makes him excellent at security. Xavier stretched his legs out, crossed them at the ankle. This morning he wore dark slacks and a white linen shirt with the sleeves rolled up, somehow managing to look elegant and comfortable simultaneously. Though I'm glad he's making your confinement more bearable. The word, confinement, hung between us. We'd been carefully avoiding direct acknowledgement of my captivity, dancing around it with euphemisms about protection and security. Hearing it stated plainly felt like breaking an unspoken agreement. I've been reviewing the case files you provided, I said, changing the subject. The corporate espionage retrieval particularly interests me. You recovered stolen pharmaceutical research from a competitor who'd bribed someone in the development lab. The Meridian case, yes. Client had spent 8 years and $40 million developing a novel cancer treatment. One of their researchers sold the complete formula to a Chinese pharmaceutical company for $500,000 and immediate employment. Xavier's expression hardened. Legal channels would have taken years to navigate international patent disputes. By then, the competitor would have rushed a generic version to market and destroyed the client's investment. So you stole it back. I retrieved property that had been illegally obtained and returned it to its rightful owner. There's a moral distinction. A distinction that wouldn't hold up in court. Courts are designed to protect procedural integrity, not substantive justice. Sometimes those values align, often they don't. He turned to face me more fully. You read the outcome documentation. The client successfully brought their treatment to market. It's now helping thousands of cancer patients, and the researcher who sold the formula was prosecuted for theft of trade secrets. Everyone except the Chinese competitor got an appropriate result. I couldn't argue with the outcome, which was precisely the problem. Xavier's operations existed in spaces where legal frameworks failed to provide justice, and his success rate suggested he was genuinely good at filling those gaps. It would be so much easier if he were simply a criminal pursuing profit. The complexity made him both more dangerous and more compelling. I've been developing a proposal, I said, pulling a folded document from my pocket. Potential transition paths, from illegal operations to legitimate business models that could achieve similar outcomes within legal frameworks. Xavier took the document, unfolded it with raised eyebrows. You've been busy. I spent 40 hours this week researching private investigation, licensing requirements, legal conflict resolution services, legitimate asset recovery operations. There are established firms doing essentially what you do, just with proper licensing and regulatory compliance. And making a fraction of the revenue because they're constrained by legal limitations on methods and client selection. He scanned the document, his expression unreadable. You're proposing I obtain PI licenses in multiple jurisdictions, establish partnerships with law firms to provide legal cover for investigation activities, and transition the gambling operations into a legitimate casino consultancy service. It's a starting framework. Obviously, there would be complexities in implementation, but the fundamental concept is sound. You could achieve 70 to 80% of your current impact through legal channels. And the other 20 to 30%? The cases where legal methods aren't effective? Xavier set down the document. What happens to clients who need results conventional services can't provide? They use conventional services and accept conventional limitations. That's how functioning legal systems work. For people wealthy enough to afford prolonged legal battles, or patient enough to wait years for resolution. For everyone else, the system offers theoretical justice with minimal practical access. He stood, moved to examine a particularly impressive climbing rose draping over a trellis. You're asking me to abandon the clients who need me most in exchange for regulatory compliance that benefits no one except law enforcement statistics. I'm asking you to reduce your legal exposure while maintaining as much impact as possible. This isn't binary. You don't have to choose between complete criminality and complete surrender. There's middle ground. middle ground that still involves abandoning core principles. Xavier's voice had taken on an edge I recognized from our earlier confrontations. The reason my operations work is precisely because I'm not constrained by legal limitations. The moment I accept those constraints, I become just another service provider offering expensive solutions to wealthy clients. You'd be a legal service provider who can operate openly without constant risk of prosecution. I'd be a neutered version of what I built, helping fewer people less effectively. He turned to face me, frustration evident in the set of his shoulders. This proposal is well-researched and professionally presented, but it fundamentally misunderstands what I'm trying to achieve. Heat rose in my chest, not embarrassment but anger. What I understand is that you've built something impressive that will inevitably collapse because it's structurally unsustainable. You have maybe 5 years before someone makes a mistake or gets caught or decides to flip on you for reduced charges. Everything you've built, the scholarships, the conflict resolution services, the furniture restoration hobby, all of it disappears the moment a prosecutor decides you're worth the effort. So I should preemptively surrender to avoid that possibility. You should plan for inevitable evolution instead of pretending you can maintain the status quo forever. I stood, frustration propelling me to my feet. I'm trying to help you preserve something valuable while protecting yourself from the consequences of illegal operations. But that requires acknowledging reality instead of indulging in philosophical justifications for criminal behavior. Xavier moved closer, eliminating the careful distance we'd maintained. And what reality is that, Yara? That legal systems are perfect, and anyone operating outside them is automatically wrong? That procedural compliance matters more than substantive outcomes? That you can't help anyone from federal prison? The words came out sharper than I intended, carrying emotion I hadn't meant to reveal. You think I don't understand what you're trying to do? I grew up in the communities you're trying to help. I know exactly how the system fails people, how it creates barriers designed to maintain inequality. But I also know that martyring yourself to prove a point helps no one. Is that what concerns you? Xavier's voice had dropped to something quieter, more dangerous. That I might end up in prison? I'm concerned that you're so committed to your particular vision of justice that you're blind to reasonable alternatives. That your ego is preventing you from accepting help. I held his gaze despite my pulse racing. And yes, I'm concerned about what happens to the scholarship students when you're inevitably prosecuted. Because you will be, Xavier. It's not a question of if, just when. Then I suppose I should make the most of the time I have left. He stepped closer still, near enough that I could see gold flecks in his dark eyes, could smell cedar and roses, and something uniquely him. Instead of wasting it on compromise that contradicts everything I've built. That's not what I'm suggesting, isn't it? You're asking me to become someone safer, more acceptable to legal frameworks designed to prevent exactly the kind of systemic change I'm trying to create. His hand lifted, fingertips brushing my jawline in a touch so light I might have imagined it. I appreciate the effort, Yara. Genuinely. But I'm not interested in neutering my impact to satisfy your need for regulatory compliance. My need? I pulled back from his touch, anger, and something more complicated flooding through me. I spent 40 hours developing that proposal because I thought you actually wanted help finding sustainable alternatives. But you're not interested in evolution or adaptation. You just want someone to validate your choices, while you continue down a path that will inevitably destroy everything you've built. And what would you have me do instead? Abandon the students who depend on scholarship funding because it comes from illegal sources? Turn away clients who need help because legal services have failed them? Become another wealthy businessman who attends charity galas and congratulates himself for maintaining the status quo? I'd have you be smart enough to recognize when someone is trying to help you, instead of attacking their motives. I don't need help. I need... He stopped abruptly, jaw tightening. What? What do you need? Xavier's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to identify. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He laughed, sharp and bitter. I don't actually know. That's the problem. The admission seemed to cost him something. I watched the control he maintained so carefully crack slightly, revealing frustration and uncertainty beneath the assured exterior. The proposal is good, he said, after a long moment. Professionally competent, thoughtfully researched, genuinely trying to find workable solutions. And you're right, that my operations are unsustainable long-term. But Yara, he met my gaze directly. I'm not ready to surrender what I've built. Not yet. Possibly not ever. Then you're a fool who'll end up in prison out of stubborn pride. Probably. A slight smile crossed his face. Though I appreciate you caring enough to be angry about it. The observation hit harder than it should have. Because he was right. I was angry not just professionally, but personally. Somewhere in the past few weeks, Xavier Fonseca had stopped being just an audit subject and started being someone whose fate mattered beyond the scope of my professional obligations, which was terrifying and inappropriate and complicated in ways I wasn't ready to examine. I should get back to the office, I said, needing distance from whatever was happening between us. I have quarterly variance analyses to complete. Of course. But Xavier didn't move to let me pass, though I was hoping you might stay longer. There's a particularly unusual variety at the far end of the garden I wanted to show you. Rosa mutabilis. The petals actually change color over their bloom period, starting yellow and transitioning through pink to crimson. I really should work. The analyses will still be there this afternoon. His voice softened. And I find I enjoy your company, even when you're calling me a fool. Despite my better judgment, I stayed. Let him guide me through the garden, explaining the history of each variety, the challenges of cultivation, the delicate balance required to maintain heirloom roses in modern conditions. His passion for the subject was evident in every gesture, every carefully considered word. We were examining the color-changing mutabilis rose when my phone buzzed. Actually buzzed, for the first time since arriving at the estate. I pulled it from my pocket, staring at the sudden appearance of a signal. The walls block most cellular service, Xavier explained. But this section of the garden has a gap in coverage. You can make calls from here if needed. The casual revelation sent a chill through me. He was showing me this deliberately, offering me the ability to contact the outside world while simultaneously demonstrating that he'd known about this gap all along and simply chosen not to mention it. It was a test. I looked at the phone in my hand, at the signal bars indicating I could call my supervisor, the authorities, anyone I wanted. Could report everything I'd learned, trigger the investigation that would inevitably destroy Xavier's operations. Could do exactly what my professional obligations required. Instead, I powered off the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. The mutabilis is beautiful, I said quietly. Show me more. Xavier's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd understood the significance of what I'd just chosen not to do. This way, he said, leading me deeper into the garden. There's a whole section of climbing roses that bloom twice annually. Quite spectacular. As I followed him along the gravel paths, surrounded by flowers cultivated over generations, I acknowledged what I'd been avoiding for weeks. I wasn't just trying to help Xavier find legal alternatives. I was actively choosing to protect him, to preserve what he'd built, to become complicit in operations I knew were criminal. And I wasn't entirely sure when that shift had happened or why. 38 days left in my contract. 38 days to figure out whether I was making the right choice or the comfortable one. 38 days before I'd have to decide whether to file an honest report or protect a criminal I was increasingly certain I was falling for. The roses bloomed around us, beautiful and resilient and carefully cultivated. Just like the impossible situation I'd allowed myself to grow into, The threatening message arrived on day 53, slipped under my office door while I was having breakfast with Xavier. A single sheet of paper, typewritten, unsigned. Ms. Rice, your audit has taken unusually long. We require preliminary findings by end of business Friday, or will assume the worst about your involvement with Fonseca's operations. Compliance ensures your safety. Resistance has consequences. No signature, no identifying information. But the implication was clear. Someone outside Xavier's organization knew I was here, knew what I was investigating, and was now applying pressure to force a specific outcome. I showed Xavier the note over coffee. He read it twice, his expression darkening with each pass. Zeferino Barros, he said finally, setting down the paper. One of my former business partners. We had a disagreement about operational ethics 6 months ago. I bought out his stake and ended the association. Disagreement about ethics seems mild for someone sending threats. Zeferino wanted to expand into services I considered unacceptable: genuine extortion, money laundering for narcotics operations, information brokering that would harm innocent people. When I refused, he accused me of being hypocritical, given our existing operations. Xavier's jaw tightened. The buyout was generous, but apparently he's still bitter about being forced out. And now he's using my audit as leverage to damage your operations. I reread the note, analyzing the phrasing for additional information. He wants me to file a report that triggers immediate investigation. Probably has contacts in law enforcement who'd act quickly on credible allegations from an independent auditor. Which means he's been monitoring the estate, tracking your activities, waiting for an opportunity to apply pressure. Xavier pulled out his phone, typed a quick message. I'm having Klaus increase security protocols. You don't leave the main house without escort until we resolve this. I'm already confined to the property. How much more restricted can my movements be? Restricted enough that Zeferino can't access you directly. He met my gaze seriously. This is an idle threat, Yara. Zeferino has connections to people who don't observe my ethical boundaries. If he thinks using you as leverage will force me into compliance or destroy my operations, he won't hesitate to escalate. The possibility of actual physical danger hadn't felt real until that moment. The past 7 weeks had been strange, yes. Confinement, constant observation, complicated attraction to the man who'd essentially kidnapped me. But it had also been oddly safe, contained within the bubble of Xavier's estate, where the worst threats were philosophical debates about legal frameworks. This was different. This was someone outside Xavier's control, operating without his ethical constraints, viewing me as a tool rather than a person. What does he want from you? I asked. Beyond damaging your operations? Reinstatement as partner, probably. Access to client networks, revenue streams, the reputation I've built over 20 years. Xavier's expression was cold in a way I'd never seen before. Zeferino is competent at the mechanics of the business, but lacks the judgment to operate independently. He wants the infrastructure I've created without doing the work to build his own. And if I file the report he's demanding, trigger an investigation that shuts down your operations, then he positions himself as a cooperative witness, potentially avoids prosecution in exchange for testimony, and inherits my client relationships when I'm imprisoned. Xavier stood, moved to the window. It's actually a clever strategy. Force you to expose me, then profit from the fallout. The casual analysis of how his empire might be destroyed was typically Xavier, treating existential threats with the same professional detachment he brought to business planning. But I could see tension in his shoulders, in the way his hands gripped the windowsill. I'm not filing that report, I said firmly. Whatever Zeferino thinks he can accomplish by threatening me, he's miscalculated. You should consider it. Xavier didn't turn around. Filing an honest report protects you legally, ends your involvement in questionable operations, possibly saves your career. It's the rational choice. Rational choice would have been running the moment I realized what you were. I'm well past rational at this point. I moved to stand beside him at the window. Besides, I've spent 7 weeks analyzing your operations. I know exactly what gets destroyed if Zeffirino succeeds. I'm not participating in that outcome. Xavier finally looked at me, something vulnerable beneath his usual control. This isn't your fight, Yara. It became my fight when someone started threatening me to manipulate your business decisions. I held his gaze. What's the plan? The shift in his expression was subtle but unmistakable. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude. Klaus is already implementing additional security. I'll reach out to contacts who can trace Zeffirino's current location and activities. And we wait to see what his next move is. That's not a plan. That's reacting to someone else's strategy. Do you have a better suggestion? I considered the situation, applying the same analytical framework I used for financial audits. He's counting on me being intimidated into compliance, or you being distracted by protecting me. We should flip the equation, give him what he thinks he wants while simultaneously gathering evidence of his threats and extortion attempts. You want to pretend to cooperate while building a case against him? I want to document everything so when this inevitably involves law enforcement, we control the narrative. I moved to my desk, pulled up a blank document. I file a preliminary report stating I've found irregularities requiring further investigation. Vague enough to suggest potential criminal activity without providing specific evidence. That satisfies Zeffirino's immediate demand and makes him think I'm complying, while actually protecting my operations by not revealing actionable intelligence. Exactly. Meanwhile, you use your resources to document Zeffirino's threats, his attempts to manipulate an independent audit, his contacts with corrupt law enforcement. Build a counter case that positions him as the criminal rather than the whistleblower. Xavier studied me for a long moment. You're suggesting we fight dirty. I'm suggesting we fight strategically. There's a difference. I started typing, drafting the preliminary report. Zeffirino assumed I'm either naive enough to scare easily or idealistic enough to prioritize legal compliance over practical outcomes. He didn't account for the possibility that I might be neither. What are you then? The question stopped me mid-sentence. What was I? Professionally compromised, certainly. I'd crossed so many ethical lines in the past 7 weeks that my auditing license was probably forfeit, regardless of how this ended. Personally involved with a man I was supposed to be investigating objectively, actively working to protect criminal operations I'd been hired to expose. Practical, I said finally, focused on outcomes rather than procedures, willing to bend rules when following them produces worse results. I met his gaze. Apparently you've been a bad influence. His smile was genuine, warm in a way that made something flutter in my chest. I prefer to think of it as good influence toward pragmatic morality, rather than rigid compliance. That's the kind of rationalization that lands people in prison, or creates scholarship programs that change hundreds of lives. He moved behind my chair, looking over my shoulder at the draft report. The preliminary findings look appropriately vague. Any investigator reading this would want more specifics before taking action, which buys us time to build the counter case against Zeffirino. I added another paragraph, carefully threading the needle between suggesting irregularities and providing evidence. How long to document his threats and corruption? Klaus has contacts who can move quickly when properly motivated. 48 hours to compile preliminary evidence, another week to build comprehensive documentation. Xavier's hand settled on my shoulder, warm and grounding. Assuming Zeffirino doesn't escalate in the meantime. The physical contact sent awareness skittering down my spine. Over the past weeks, we'd maintained careful distance despite the growing tension between us. The occasional brush of hands when passing documents, his touch at my back guiding me through the mansion, fleeting moments of contact that felt charged with possibility. But this was different. Deliberate, sustained. A claim rather than an accident. You should move to the family wing, Xavier said quietly. The guest suite is too exposed. If Zeffirino attempts direct access to you, I want you where security is tightest. The family wing. That's where your bedroom is. Among others, there are 4 guest suites in that section, all with better security than your current accommodation. His hand tightened slightly on my shoulder. Though, if you'd prefer to stay in your current location despite the risk, I'll increase guard rotations instead. It was a choice, genuinely offered. I could maintain the physical separation we'd carefully preserved, or I could accept closer proximity with all its implications. The family wing makes sense from a security perspective, I said, keeping my voice professionally neutral even as my pulse raced. When should I relocate? Klaus is preparing a suite now. This afternoon, if you're comfortable with the timeline. I saved the draft report, stood to face him properly. And after we deal with Zeffirino? After the threat is neutralized and my contract period ends? Xavier's expression shifted into something more guarded. What do you want to happen? I asked first. Fair enough. He stepped back, giving me space. I want you to stay, not as a contractor or an auditor, or even as someone helping me transition to legal operations. Just stay. Help me figure out what sustainable evolution actually looks like. Challenge me when I'm being stubborn. Bring practical analysis to philosophical justifications. You want a permanent consultant. I want a partner. The word hung between us, weighted with implications beyond business arrangements. Someone who understands both the operational realities and the moral complexities. Someone I trust with comprehensive knowledge of the organization. Someone who calls me a fool when I deserve it, and still chooses to help anyway. My throat tightened with emotion I wasn't ready to examine. Xavier, I know it's complicated. I know I've put you in an impossible position. That staying means deeper complicity in questionable operations. That your professional reputation is probably already damaged beyond repair. He moved closer again, his hand lifting to cup my face with devastating gentleness. But I've spent 7 weeks watching you dissect my life's work with ruthless precision, while simultaneously trying to find ways to preserve it. And somewhere in that process, I stopped seeing you as a threat to manage and started seeing you as someone essential. Essential to your operations or essential to you? Both. I'm done pretending there's a meaningful distinction. His thumb brushed along my cheekbone. I'm 43 years old, Yara. I've built an empire, helped hundreds of students, restored countless pieces of furniture, and maintained careful emotional distance from everyone in my life. And then you walked through a door you shouldn't have opened, and everything shifted. You locked that door, threatened me, held me prisoner for weeks. I did, and I'm not proud of the fear I caused or the control I exercised. His voice dropped to something quieter, more vulnerable. But I'm also not sorry it happened, because it brought you here. Into my life, into my operations, into spaces I didn't know were empty until you filled them. I should have stepped back, maintained professional boundaries, reminded him that what he was describing was deeply inappropriate given our circumstances. But I'd spent 7 weeks analyzing Xavier Fonseca's life with meticulous attention to every detail. I'd seen his scholarship programs, his furniture restoration, his rose garden cultivated with patient care. I'd watched him navigate moral complexities with thoughtful precision, maintain ethical standards within criminal operations, choose helping over exploiting at every decision point. And somewhere in that analysis, I'd stopped seeing a subject to audit and started seeing a man worth understanding. I'm not built for staying, I said quietly. My entire life has been about maintaining independence, protecting myself from vulnerability, keeping emotions separate from professional obligations. What you're asking requires abandoning all of that. I know. And if you choose to leave when your contract ends, I'll respect that decision. No threats, No manipulation, no consequences beyond my personal disappointment. His other hand found my waist, not pulling me closer but anchoring us both. But Yara, I think you're braver than you give yourself credit for. I think you walked into my bedroom because you were already curious about the discrepancies you'd found. I think you stayed these 7 weeks, not just because I made it difficult to leave, but because you genuinely wanted to understand. And I think you're considering staying permanently, because you recognize that some equations are worth solving, even when the variables are complicated. That's a lot of assumptions about my motivations. Am I wrong? I wanted to say yes, to deny the accuracy of his assessment, to retreat behind professional objectness and familiar emotional distance. But I'd spent my career dealing in honest numbers, in data that revealed truth regardless of comfort. And the truth was that Xavier had somehow become essential to me too. That the thought of leaving, of never seeing his rare, genuine smile, or engaging in our verbal sparring, or walking through rose gardens discussing philosophy, it created an ache in my chest that had nothing to do with professional obligations and everything to do with feelings I'd been carefully avoiding acknowledging. You're not wrong, I admitted, which terrifies me. Good. I'd be concerned if you weren't terrified. This is terrifying. But he smiled when he said it, the expression transforming his face. Though perhaps we could be terrified together, instead of separately. Before I could respond, before I could overthink or retreat, or do any of the sensible things my rational mind was screaming at me to do, I closed the distance between us and kissed him. Xavier made a sound of surprise that melted into something deeper as he pulled me closer, his hands settling at my waist with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. The kiss was nothing like I'd imagined during the moments I'd allowed myself to imagine it. Not aggressive or demanding, but patient, thorough, a conversation conducted through touch rather than words. When we finally broke apart, both breathing harder, Xavier rested his forehead against mine. We should probably discuss the implications, he said, his voice rough. Establish boundaries, clarify expectations, address the power imbalance inherent in our circumstances. Probably, I agreed, not moving. Or we could finish relocating me to the family wing and deal with Zeffirino's threat before having complicated relationship conversations. Practical as always. But his smile suggested he didn't mind. Klaus should have your suite ready. I'll help you move your things. The relocation took less than an hour. I'd lived efficiently for so long that my possessions fit in 2 small suitcases and a briefcase full of documents. The family wing suite was indeed more luxurious than my previous accommodation, with a sitting room that connected to a bedroom decorated in warm neutrals and rich blues, and it was 3 doors down from Xavier's bedroom. Close enough that I could hear him moving around in the early mornings when he woke before dawn. Security protocols, Klaus explained as he demonstrated the suite's features. Reinforced door, direct communication to the main security station, panic button connected to my personal line. If Zeffirino or anyone else attempts unauthorized access, you'll have immediate response. Thank you, Klaus. I meant it. The gruff security chief had become an unexpected ally over the past weeks. And thank you for the coffee recommendations. You were right about the French press method. He almost smiled. My daughter says I'm insufferable about coffee, but there are standards that must be maintained. After Klaus left, I stood in my new suite trying to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. Threatening messages, security escalation, relationship revelations, kisses that complicated already complex situations. My methodical accountant's brain wanted to organize it all into neat categories, analyze risk factors, develop contingency plans. But the rest of me, the part that had spent 7 weeks being transformed by proximity to Xavier Fonseca and his peculiar empire, just wanted to see where this led. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. Xavier stood in the hallway, changed into casual clothes for evening, holding 2 glasses of wine. I thought we should toast your new accommodations, he said, and perhaps have those complicated relationship conversations after all. I accepted the glass, gestured him into the sitting room. Establishing boundaries and expectations? Among other things. He settled onto the sofa, looking oddly uncertain for someone usually so controlled. I want to be clear, Yara. What happened earlier, the kiss, the admission of feelings, I'm not expecting that to override your autonomy or professional judgment. You can still choose to leave when your contract ends. You can file an honest audit report that destroys my operations. You can decide that the complications outweigh the potential benefits. But you'd prefer I didn't. I'd prefer you stayed and helped me build something sustainable, but preference and expectation are different calculations. He took a sip of wine. I've spent weeks controlling aspects of your life I had no right to control. I don't want to continue that pattern in a romantic context. The fact that he recognized the distinction, that he was actively trying to separate professional obligation from personal choice, made something warm settle in my chest. I'm staying, I said. Not just until the contract ends, past it. I'm staying to help you transition operations, to build the legal alternative frameworks I proposed, to be whatever kind of partner you need. Business, personal, both. Xavier's relief was visible. You're certain? I spent 40 hours developing a transition proposal because I want your empire to survive. I kissed you because somewhere in 7 weeks of analyzing your life, I stopped being able to imagine mine without you in it. And I'm staying because leaving would mean abandoning both the work and the person, and I'm not willing to do either. Even knowing it means deeper complicity in questionable operations? Even knowing that. I set down my wine glass. Though I have conditions, name them. We implement the legal transition framework within 2 years. No excuses, no delays, no justifications for maintaining status quo. I'll help you preserve impact while reducing criminal exposure, but the endpoint is legitimate operations. Agreed. What else? We establish clear boundaries between business operations and personal relationship. No using romantic leverage to influence professional decisions or vice versa. If we're going to be partners in both senses, we need separation between the contexts. Reasonable. Continue. And you stop sending me flowers. At his surprised expression, I smiled. Not because I don't appreciate them. Because I want to choose this relationship freely, not because you've been romancing me with beautiful gestures. When you give me roses now, I want it to be because we've built something together, not because you're trying to convince me to stay. Xavier was quiet for a moment, processing my conditions. Then he smiled, genuine, warm, the expression that transformed his face from merely handsome to something that made my breath catch. You're going to be an extraordinary partner, he said, in all senses of the word. I'm going to be a pain in your ass. I'll question every decision, challenge every assumption, refuse to be charmed into compliance when you're being stubborn. I'm counting on it. He stood, offered his hand. Come with me. There's something I want to show you. I let him lead me through the mansion to his bedroom, the same room where this had all begun 7 weeks ago. But this time, I walked through the door willingly. No coercion or confusion, just choice. Xavier moved to a wall safe I hadn't noticed before, entered a combination, withdrew a small velvet box. When I bought out Zeffirino's partnership 6 months ago, he began. He accused me of being sentimental, of letting personal ethics interfere with profitable business opportunities. He was right, actually. I do let sentiment guide decisions that should be purely strategic. He opened the box, revealing a ring, simple platinum band with a single diamond, elegant without being ostentatious. I bought this the week after you arrived, which was absurd because I barely knew you and you were technically my prisoner, and the entire situation was inappropriate in every possible way. Xavier's voice was quiet, almost embarrassed. But something about watching you dissect my financial records with ruthless precision while trying to find ways to preserve what mattered. I knew. Even then, I knew you were someone worth keeping. I stared at the ring, emotions flooding through me too complex to name. Xavier, I'm not proposing. Not yet. We have too much to navigate first. Legal transitions, relationship foundations, addressing the power dynamics that brought us together. He closed the box, set it on the dresser. But I wanted you to know that this isn't casual for me. Hasn't been from the beginning. Whatever we build together, I'm committed to building it properly. You're a criminal with questionable judgment and a habit of making unilateral decisions that affect other people's lives, I said, moving closer. You locked me in a bedroom, searched my belongings, and held me prisoner for 7 weeks. By any objective measure, I should run screaming from anything resembling a relationship with you. And yet you're also the most morally complex, intellectually stimulating, frustratingly principled person I've ever met. You've built something genuinely impactful from questionable methods. You cultivate roses, and restore furniture, and create opportunities for students who remind you of yourself. I reached up to cup his face, feeling the scratch of evening stubble against my palm. And somehow, against all logic and professional training and common sense, I want to stay and see what we can build together. Xavier kissed me then, not the careful, questioning kiss from earlier, but something deeper, more certain. A promise and a claim, and a beginning all at once. When we finally broke apart, he smiled against my mouth. 2 years to legal transition. Clear boundaries between business and personal. No more flowers until we've earned them. Those are the conditions. I can work within those parameters. His hand settled at my waist, anchoring us together, though I reserve the right to be occasionally stubborn about implementation details. I expect nothing less. I kissed him again, softer this time. Now tell me the actual plan for dealing with Zeffirino, because I'm not spending our first night together worrying about threats from bitter ex-business partners. Xavier laughed, the sound genuine and surprised. Practical, even in romantic moments. This is going to be interesting. You have no idea. As we settled onto his bed to strategize about neutralizing Zeffirino's threats while building cases for legal transition, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Certainty. Not about the logistics or the timeline or even the ultimate outcome, but about the choice to stay, to build, to transform something questionable into something sustainable. 7 weeks ago, I'd walked through a door I shouldn't have opened, and found a life I hadn't known I wanted. 1 year later, I stood in Xavier's workshop watching him restore a writing desk that had belonged to his grandmother. The illegal gambling operations had been systematically transitioned to legitimate casino consultancy. The conflict resolution services had been restructured under proper investigation licenses. The scholarship programs continued through independently managed foundations, with transparent funding sources, and the roses in the South Garden bloomed twice annually, carefully cultivated by a man who understood that some things worth keeping required patient, deliberate care. Xavier glanced up from his work, caught me watching, smiled. "What?" he asked. "Just observing," I replied, "noting patterns." "And what patterns do you see?" I moved closer, wrapped my arms around him from behind, pressed my cheek against his back. Growth. Transformation. Things becoming what they were always meant to be. His hands covered mine. "We make a good team." "The best," I agreed. And for once in my methodical, analytical, carefully controlled life, I didn't need spreadsheets or documentation or risk assessments to know I was exactly where I belonged.